Hello and welcome to the Inside Intelligence webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion with Renny Babiarz on geospatial intelligence and tracking China's nuclear program. My name is Peter Huggins and I'm the event producer. Please note today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Inside Intelligence playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function and we'll answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A portion of the event. With that, I will turn the event over to our moderator, Dr. Michael Ard, Program Director and Senior Lecturer for the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program.
Thank you very much, Peter, and welcome everyone to Inside Intelligence. Today, we discuss developments in China's nuclear weapons program. It's a very good day to be doing this with Presidents Biden and Xi meeting at the APEC summit in San Francisco. Now with us today is Renny Babiarz, who is Vice President of Analysis and Operations for All Source Analysis, where he manages geospatial intelligence analysis projects on security, economic, and artificial intelligence issues for government, non-government, and private sector customers. He's also an adjunct faculty member for the Johns Hopkins MS in Geospatial Intelligence program. Renny has over 20 years of experience researching China's political and military systems, including 10 years of experience in the field of geoint analysis, focusing on Asia and weapons of mass destruction. He has a PhD in political science, specializing in China's nuclear weapons program from Johns Hopkins, an MA in Asian Studies from the University of Hawaii, and certificates in Chinese language and geoint analysis. Additionally, Renny worked in public service as a geoint analyst for the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, NGA. Renny, welcome to our program today. We're really looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for that introduction, Michael. As Michael said, I have a PhD in political science, focusing in international relations, and my dissertation research concerned the history of China's nuclear weapons program. Now, my question at the time, this is about 2010, was why was the program so limited? So the United States and the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons programs that produced tens of thousands of nuclear warheads during the Cold War. Yet China, by all open source estimates, only possessed several hundred nuclear warheads throughout the history of its program, really from 1964 through, say, the early 2000s, mid-2000s. So why is that? And my answer was that it was ideas about the military in general and about nuclear weapons in particular that limited that program. Now, some of the research methods I used in my dissertation included studying locations related to China's nuclear weapons program. And today, I've continued that location-based research, or geospatial research, and geospatial just means Earth-referenced. So I've continued that geospatial research of China's nuclear weapons program. And what I've found is that China has been dramatically expanding its nuclear weapons capability really over the last 10 years, and in particular over the last 5 to 7 years. Now today, I'll be focusing on the Lop Nur nuclear weapons test site as one indicator of this expansion. So the bottom line for this presentation is that there are many observable indications that the People's Republic of China could be preparing to resume critical nuclear weapons testing at Lop Nur. Now, in the field of research that focuses on nuclear weapons testing, there's a distinction between critical tests and subcritical tests. Critical nuclear weapons testing refers to any test that results in a nuclear chain reaction explosion. Subcritical usually refers to a conventional explosion that does not result in a nuclear chain reaction. So there are many indications that the PRC could be preparing to resume critical nuclear weapons testing at Lop Nur. And this would mark the PRC's first critical nuclear weapons testing since 1996. And this would violate international norms against such testing. Now, we could get into some of the details of that, perhaps in question and answer session. But for now, it's important to note that no nuclear power has conducted a critical nuclear weapons test since 1996. Now, the methods that I've used to conduct this research involve geospatial analysis. And again, geospatial means Earth-referenced. So I've used geospatial data that includes commercial satellite imagery, such as electro-optical imagery, and electro-optical imagery just refers to digital pictures that are like the pictures that you can take with your cell phone, but they're taken by a satellite from and overhead. I've also analyzed synthetic aperture radar data. It's another type of geospatial data. I've also incorporated declassified US government reporting, academic books and articles, and various media reports. Now, to put all of this together, I've used structured geospatial observation techniques, structured geospatial analysis techniques, and structured geospatial communication techniques. And these techniques were all laid out in a book I recently co-authored with Aaron Jabor titled Geospatial Data, Information, and Intelligence. And so that really lays out the tradecraft that I've used to do this analysis. Now, I'm going to focus on nuclear weapons testing, but I'm going to start by putting testing within the context of the nuclear weapons cycle. The nuclear weapons cycle is divided into 5 categories that a state needs to follow to produce and deploy a nuclear weapon. And it begins with research and development. So this covers everything from basic theoretical physics research to material science, to the engineering of constructing a warhead, to them producing a prototype warhead design. Once a state has produced a prototype warhead, it needs to test it. Now, testing is essential because a state needs to know that when a weapon detonates, it's going to detonate with enough explosive power that is predicted it will have. It needs to make sure that it's going to detonate when it wants to, and it needs to make sure that it detonates in the way in which it expects. Once testing is complete and there's a warhead design that has been tested to work according to the satisfaction of the state, then it goes into production, and a certain number of warheads are produced at specialized facilities. Once warheads are produced, they must be stored someplace, short-term, medium-term, and long-term. And then specific storage can also depend on methods of deployment. Now, when we talk about nuclear weapon deployment, this refers to the classic nuclear triad that was developed by the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War: land, air, and sea methods of deploying nuclear weapons. This is the nuclear weapons cycle. I'm focusing on testing as one category within this full cycle. Now, testing is absolutely essential. It's important for nuclear warhead development to make sure that a nuclear warhead that is new works the way that it's supposed to. But testing is also important from a monitoring perspective. Other states need to monitor nuclear weapons testing to make sure they know, first of all, what other countries are doing with nuclear weapons, and in the event of an actual critical nuclear weapons test event, researching that event, studying it, monitoring it, understanding aspects of it, can yield insight into the types of developments that are taking place. So it is very important to monitor these events. So now we're going to focus on the Lop Nur nuclear weapons test site, and I'll begin with a small amount of history of the site. To start, Lop Nur is a dried lake bed within a remote desert region in the People's Republic of China's Xinjiang province, south of the capital city Urumqi and east of the city Korla. In the early 1960s, as the PRC developed its strategic nuclear weapons program, it chose Lop Nur as that area to test nuclear weapons. And there are several historical nuclear weapons testing areas at Lop Nur, a headquarters area, and a newly established Eastern Probable test area. This is an overview map of the Lop Nur nuclear weapons test site. Up in the upper left-hand corner, you see Lop Nur is located in the PRC's northwest. In the center of the map, we see 6 areas. The 2 southernmost areas outlined in blue are inactive test areas. These are the locations of China's original nuclear tests. Just north of that, there are 4 active areas, and they include the Northern Tunnel Test Area, the Nuclear Test Area Headquarters, the Vertical Shaft Test Area, and the Eastern Probable Test Area. Next, we're going to zoom in to those 4 active areas. Up in the upper left, we see the Northern Tunnel Test Area. Then just to the south of that, the Nuclear Test Area Headquarters, the Vertical Shaft Test Area, and the Eastern Probable Test Area. Now, the important thing to note on this graphic is that all of these areas are linked to one another via roads. And in the case of the Eastern Probable Test Area, this was recently constructed within the last 3 to 4 years. And when it was constructed, it was linked via newly graded roads to established parts of the nuclear weapons test site. Now, here are some indications of significant investment at the Lop Nur nuclear weapons test site. We'll begin with the Northern Tunnel Test Area and upgrades there. This location has been assessed to be related to subcritical and small yield critical nuclear weapons tests in the past. This is an overview of the Northern Tunnel Test Area. There are 5 tunnels. We label these tunnels with the letter T, standing for tunnel, and then the numbers 1 through 5. This is an electro-optical image of the tunnels. And outside of T1, T2, T3, and T5, there are indications of spoil piles outside of the tunnel, particularly at T5. And particularly at T5, these spoil piles have grown over the last, I'd say, 4 to 5 years. In addition, at several of the tunnel entrances, there have been indications of construction equipment arriving and departing. The position of the spoil pile at T5 in particular, and the observation of multiple types of construction equipment there over the years suggests that the spoil piles are a result of excavations occurring within Tunnel 5. Now, in addition to that, I have access to change detection analysis of radar, synthetic aperture radar data from June through September 2023 that shows activity, ongoing activity at T1, T2, and T5. And this is via the company Ingenispace. This radar analysis shows minute changes to the ground surface in this location. It's analysis of high-resolution radar data that's looking for disturbances on the Earth in this area. And this analysis shows that there have been significant disturbances to the Earth on the roads leading to T1, T2, and T5, and to the areas just outside of the tunnel entrances. It is probable that these disturbances are the result of vehicle traffic to and from the tunnels and various types of equipment moving and vehicles moving and people moving just outside the tunnels. So this shows that there's ongoing activity at this location. Next, there is a new area of the Lop Nur nuclear weapons test site that has been constructed over the last few years. And we can see this through the discovery of a probable underground facility. I discovered this underground facility in early 2021. Note that the eastern probable test area is linked to the vertical shaft test area via newly graded roads. The outline in red shows a road that was graded in 2020. The line in blue shows a road that was constructed in 2021, leading to a new area of construction in the east, which was probably an underground facility. We see these newly graded roads leading to this location. There are indications of a spoil pile, possible trucks, a covered support area, various types of construction equipment, reconfigured landscape in the area where part of a hill was completely demolished, probably for water control, and then a tent-like structure covering a probable underground facility entrance. Now, while I do not know what the function of this probable underground facility is, it's clear that this was a significant investment in a new part of the Lop Nur nuclear weapons test site. And this location, again, is linked to known nuclear weapons test site locations at Lop Nur. In addition, there have been high voltage electricity transmission upgrades to the Lop Nur nuclear weapons test site and within the Lop Nur nuclear weapons test site. So between 2021 and 2022, new high voltage electricity transmission infrastructure, shown by the line in red, was constructed leading to the Lop Nur nuclear weapons test site. And then within the test site, there were medium voltage electricity distribution infrastructure that was built between 2021 and 2022 from the west all the way to the east into the eastern probable test area. Now, this is significant because this has not been done in decades, first of all. So this is a brand new set of infrastructure that's constructed. It's a significant investment. It costs a lot to build. This is over a very large area. And it's significant now because the eastern probable test area can now operate all year round in all weather. So when it's cold, there's electricity to power heaters. When it's hot in the summer, there's electricity to power air conditioners. It can also operate 24 hours a day, so it can operate at night. So this is significant, and it again reinforces that this new area of construction in the east is linked to known nuclear weapons test areas at Lop Nur. So we've seen indications of significant investment at Lop Nur. And now let's come back to the question of why would China want to test a nuclear weapon? Why would China want to conduct a critical nuclear weapons test? Well, one hypothesis is that China is developing a new set of warheads, a new set of nuclear warheads. This could be for miniaturization, for smaller weapons. This could be for so-called counterforce weapons. These are smaller weapons that require much greater accuracy and are built to target other countries' nuclear weapons forces. So they must be highly maneuverable and very accurate and typically smaller yield. Or they could be for new weapons delivery systems. So for example, it's well known that China is pursuing hypersonic missile research. Hypersonic missiles are much faster and much more maneuverable than ballistic missiles. This greater speed and maneuverability puts the components of the missile under much greater pressures and forces. And so a new warhead design might be required if you're going to make a nuclear warhead with a hypersonic missile delivery system. So this is a hypothesis, but these are some of the things that we can think about in terms of why a test might be conducted in the future. So that concludes the talk, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Renny, for that. And we'll be taking questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A function. I'll get to them in a few minutes. And I want to just let's take a step back for a minute and talk about China's nuclear program in general. I mean, you mentioned this was an interest of yours as a graduate student, a PhD candidate, and why they were focusing on just a deterrent force. The number was something like, for 300 potential warheads for a long time, right? And then this has changed over the last 10 years or so. But what is their actual nuclear deployment now? You mentioned they have a nuclear triad. What does that look like?
Sure. So it's still estimated to be in the hundreds, so in terms of warhead numbers, but that is growing according to multiple open source reports, including Department of Defense's own annual report on China's military. Now, in terms of a triad, China does have now all three parts of the nuclear triad. It was just in the last decade that it was able to successfully start deploying the sea-based leg of that triad. That's usually on submarine-launched ballistic missile submarines, where you put a ballistic missile with a nuclear warhead on it inside a submarine. It sails out on deterrence missions. It took China 60 years to develop this. It was very slow and incremental, and finished. And now it does reportedly, according to open source DoD reporting, have SLBM submarines out on nuclear deterrence missions. And so it does have all three parts of the triad. Recently, I think 2 years ago, there were open source media reports about land-based missile silo fields that were constructed in China's northern central and western areas. There are 3 major missile fields in those areas. So there's been significant investment in all parts of the nuclear weapons triad, according to open sources. So there's definitely been expansion there. That's just one part of the nuclear weapons cycle, and we see additional investment and expansion in the other 4 parts as well.
Do we have any idea of how many they keep in reserve, or how many they actually deploy of their nuclear weapons or nuclear warheads?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's still in the hundreds. It might be between 500 and 700 now. I'd have to look at the specific estimates. It's definitely been growing. Historically, that is before the last 10-year period, historically, China had a no first use policy, and it had a policy of storing, at least according to open sources, nuclear warheads separate from deployment systems. And this meant that it would take longer to bring them together to use them, and that was intentional as a safety mechanism. There are some indications that might be changing now, but it's somewhat unclear.
So, yeah, I mean, the consequence of all this could be, this is all speculation, right? That they may actually be moving away from their official no first use policy.
So I think great question. This is something that is, I think, a mystery for a lot of people, including current US policymakers. That is, there are clear indications in looking at geospatial information and geospatial data and analyzing it carefully, especially historically over the last 10 years, to see industry and facilities associated with all parts of the nuclear weapons cycle dramatically expanding. There's heavy investment in these areas. That's a clear sign of a shift in the capability to produce and deploy nuclear weapons. Now, what does that mean in terms of policy? I think there are a lot of question marks about that, especially over the last few years, as there have been reports that the United States and China's military-to-military dialogues have lessened and even stopped over the last couple of years. And so I think that lack of engagement has increased the number of questions about the intention related to this dramatic expansion that we can see in the data that we've analyzed.
What's been China's position on nuclear arms control and talks with the US?
That's a great question, and it's changed over time. And so at the end of the Cold War, China was actually much more open to dialogue about its nuclear weapons program. Nuclear weapons scientists visited China. Former intelligence officers also visited parts of the program. So, for example, there's a book called The Nuclear Express by Stillman and Reed that details how there were visits to China in the early 1990s, including Lop Nur, to take a look and get tours of their nuclear weapons industry. That stopped in the late 1990s and really never resumed. In terms of talks, certainly most recently, China has rejected any idea of a kind of a treaty to limit the amount of nuclear weapons that it produces or that it can deploy. I think that China was much less a target of those types of talks at the end of the Cold War because the program was known to be relatively limited.
Mhm.
However, now I think there's just rejection of that and the perception that any non-proliferation efforts are really just an effort to constrain China from pursuing its national security objectives. And so I think that that's the current general position as I understand it.
Yeah, in the lead up to the summit, what's going on out in San Francisco, the press was speculating on all the points of discussion that would be going on between Xi and President Biden, but it didn't talk about nuclear weapons, or at least I didn't see any piece on that. Do you think that could be one of them, maybe in a less conspicuous way? I do.
And in fact, I did see a couple of lines about this in a couple of reports about APEC, that there have been planned some behind-the-scenes meetings directly related to nuclear weapons talks and directly related to this idea of, well, what are the policy positions now? You know, we're all seeing and everyone's acknowledging that there are dramatic changes in the program. What does that mean? I think that some of these talks are designed to try and bridge the gap in understanding there. So I do think some of that is probably happening. I don't know for sure in detail, but based on media reports that I've read, yes, that does appear to be happening.
One more question. This goes back to your presentation, what you're able to use for this, because it was very interesting, of course, how much you were able to gain just from open source and commercially available imagery. Are companies forthcoming on sharing a lot of this imagery?
That's a great question. Yes and no. So I'll start by saying there are a number of commercial satellite imaging companies. There's a company that most people might have heard of, former Digital Globe, now Maxar. Mm-hmm. Also Planet, now Planet Labs, or maybe originally Planet Labs, now just Planet. There's another company called Satellogic. We've used some of their data as well, and several others. So these companies have different approaches to sharing data. Some of them share data freely with the media. Some of them share their data freely with nonprofit and academic communities to do this kind of research, and some don't, and it's a case-by-case basis. The idea of sharing is, I think, an important one and a good one. It's not always easy to acquire the data. Luckily, I'm in a position where I'm able to access some data to be able to do this kind of work in an academic setting. However, yes, it's really a case-by-case basis, Michael.
Great, thanks for that. Let's go to some of the questions from our audience today. One from Kerry, one of our faculty members, asks, do you see a correlation between the upgrades and the new work at this test center and the ramping up of other ICBM silos construction in China?
So yeah, that's a great question. And the correlation is temporal at this point. So looking at timelines of construction, they match, and that matches both with deployment locations. So for example, missile silo fields, parts of the test site. Now that goes back at least 10 years, but also includes in the last 5 years, in the last 2 years. Yes, there are matching timelines for certain developments there, but then also research and development facilities, production facilities, storage. So there's definitely an overlap, and it's across all parts of the weapon cycle, across facilities associated with all parts of the weapon cycle, that we see these links. And the correlation is through timeline right now.
Well, and there's somebody asked a bigger picture question, and just on the U.S.-China rivalry here, is this, are these signs a sign that China wants a new, in a sense, Cold War or geopolitical strategic rivalry with the U.S., of the type that we had with the Soviets back in the day? I mean, and I guess in the mid-'80s, there were tens of thousands of nuclear warheads deployed between the two countries. Can you foresee something of that nature happening?
So again, lots of great questions here, Michael, and this is another great one. To be clear now, in the Q&A question, or in the Q&A session, we're moving from what I can describe and know from analysis of data to now speculating about what I think about it. And this is another question where I'm speculating on this. I speculate that China sees a nuclear weapons program as part of its rise to becoming a global superpower, and that a strong nuclear weapons program, including clear deployment of nuclear weapons in all parts of the nuclear triad that are publicly known, is part of developing geopolitical strength at a global level. So this imparts national power for China to become and work with other important, powerful countries in the international system. And so I think there's a geopolitical component. That's part of what's driving this. I think that there's a hard power component to this, where historically, China has seen what large countries with, well, the United States and Soviet Union, what they're able to do in the international system, because they have very large and sophisticated nuclear weapons programs. And so I think China realizes, if it wants to become a global player with respect to military hard power, it must develop a very strong deterrent capability to do that. That's my opinion. That's my opinion. But that backstops all kinds of other hard power military options that the Chinese state might be able to pursue in the future, in my opinion.
What about hypersonic missiles? You touched on this. Do we see this as sort of the new vehicle, for nuclear weapons? Is this something that's going to replace ballistic missiles?
Well, that's a very good question, and that starts to get outside of my area of expertise when it comes to missile technology. But I will say that there's significant investment on the part of Russia, the United States, and China in this new area of technology. The deployment's different, so it's not like a traditional ballistic missile. I say traditional. It's not like a ballistic missile method of deployment. So that there are different constraints on how this can be used and deployed. It's a new technology. It does impart many new capabilities. And again, the reason I brought it up in the presentation, the reason I think it's a good question here, is that it does demand different components. And it does demand, a new warhead design, either conventional or nuclear, because the deployment system is so different. So it's so much faster and it's so much more maneuverable that you really need different materials and different components. Like, things need to be assembled differently for them to be able to withstand that speed and force associated with the system.
So it wouldn't be just a case of that you could take a standing nuclear warhead and just attach it to a hypersonic missile the same way you could with, say, if it had been designed for a ballistic missile. And
again, I am not an engineer in this space, but based on what I know, correct, it would be difficult to do that. That warheads are really designed. The design of warheads is influenced by how they're going to be deployed. We can see this in submarine launched ballistic missile systems. So warheads have to be specifically designed to a particular type of missile that's going to be ejected from a submarine and then fired out to become a ballistic missile that follows a ballistic trajectory. Those warhead designs are actually different than warhead designs for other deployment systems, just because of the parameters of launching from a submarine, to some level underwater. And so likewise, that same logic applies to a different system like a hypersonic missile.
We talked a little bit about nuclear weapon storage. Obviously, countries don't have all their nuclear warheads deployed at once. So what about storage facilities? What can we tell about that based on GeoInt? Do we have a good handle on that for China?
Great. Yeah. So there are, well, I mean, there are open source reports about China's nuclear weapons storage locations, and there's one in particular that's studied quite closely. So let me take a step back and say, for all of the areas that we look at, and for all parts of the nuclear weapons cycle, there's some basic fundamental research we can do using GeoInt that can tell us something about it. Just by looking at basic infrastructure, line of communication infrastructure. So that refers to things like roads, electricity transmission, and others. But let's just focus on roads and electricity transmission. If we just look at that, that can tell us a good deal about what's happening in a location. And yes, there are indications of upgrades in these basic areas at facilities, at storage facilities. That's significant because if you have a storage facility and suddenly you're building more roads leading to and from it, the roads are becoming more sophisticated, they're able to handle heavier weights. You can tell all of this from GeoInt, and that can tell you a great deal about the intent related to the storage facility. They're anticipating more traffic to and from the facility. They could be anticipating more traffic or heavier equipment coming, or heavier objects coming to and from the facility. That's significant. Now, you'd want to continue doing research and add to that you shouldn't stop there. But yes, those are some of the things that you can find using GeoInt, even for something like a storage facility, some of those basic foundational aspects of geospatial analysis. Study infrastructure. It's so important.
Let's talk about denial and deception, because that is something, a question in probably a lot of our minds as we were watching your presentation and Jim and Joshua both asked, what about Chinese denial and deception in this? Where did you notice any when they were looking at Lop Nur, and what techniques have maybe we've detected from them in the past?
Sure, that's a great question. One of my favorites. And I've got a couple of approaches to this question. And the first is that when it comes to nuclear weapons testing, it's very difficult to hide that because of the scale of a nuclear detonation and the amount of preparation that's required to do that safely. You need roads, you need heavy equipment, you need electricity. There's some basic things that are very difficult to hide, not impossible, but difficult to hide that you really can't get around. There's these material constraints from the physics of living on planet Earth and what you want to accomplish at a test site that you simply have to fulfill, and it's hard to hide those things. So that's one aspect in favor of monitoring. Another issue with denial and deception is that while that can undoubtedly occur, it's very difficult to carefully establish that that's occurring at any given location. And so that requires its own in-depth study. And the easiest thing for any analyst to do is to use denial and deception to confirm what they expect to see or confirm that they're not seeing what they expect to see. And so it becomes a very easy thing to slip into analytically that I push to avoid until later in the analytic process. So it's possible that some of this has been happening. Yes, we do see some possible indications that China has been trying to obscure aspects of the developments that we've seen on imagery, for example. But beyond that, I think that requires more study. And we do want to be careful to not just use the phrase denial and deception to talk ourselves into or out of certain lines of analysis. I mean, we should just continue doing the analysis as best we can.
Let's talk a little bit about the treaty frameworks for a second here. Before the program, we were talking about the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. There's a norm that's been of not testing that the United States and China have adhered to. Do we see, the Russians have rescinded that, as Kerry mentions. Do we see China maybe moving in a direction away from that as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we'll just take the United States, Russia, and China. The United States in the 1990s really began advocating other countries, particularly Russia and China, to sign this Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. The United States signed it, but did not ratify it. China signed it, but did not ratify it. Russia both signed and ratified, but then, as you said, Michael, just in the past few weeks, rescinded that ratification. Nonetheless, all three countries have, at least according to open source information, adhered to the norm of not conducting a critical nuclear weapons test since 1996. I am saying with this research that there are indications that they're moving past that they're preparing to conduct at some point in the future a critical nuclear weapons test. Now, there are other indications that are not in this presentation that this is occurring. There'll be more information coming out about this in the next few weeks. And so, feel free to invite me back and I can go into more detail about it at the time. I have not included it here because this was an overview. And I'm also waiting for this other media publication to come out. But suffice to say, there are clear indications that, yes, China is moving past this international norm. I say norm for them because the treaty was never ratified, so that's not legally binding. But it's clear indications that they're moving beyond that with the preparations that we're seeing at Lop Nur.
What about, is there other facilities besides Lop Nur for testing in China?
That's a good question. I do not know of any. Now, I should say, now we're getting into, so at research and development facilities, there are small scale facilities that you can conduct sort of theoretical physics testing. You can conduct subcritical testing at different locations. So there are other places in China where you can conduct nuclear weapons test related events. But when it comes to a critical nuclear weapons test, Lop Nur is the place to do it. And it's the only place that I know of in the country.
Okay. Let's talk about, maybe this is all a little beyond our scope, but there's a few questions here that we'll see if we can address. Type of EMP warhead, is that something that China has developed? And is this something that really makes sense in respect to nuclear deterrence?
That's another good question. I think historically, if you look at some of the declassified reporting, there have been some indications that, yes, China's produced this or has conducted this line of research. With regard to testing, I think that's less clear. That I don't think that that's quite addressed in the public record. But there are indications that China's conducted research in this area. Now, beyond that, I really don't know. But it's a good question. I mean, I'm glad it's asked. It's to say, I'll expand in this way. China's really tried to research, at least, all the major aspects of nuclear weapons, even though it may not have constructed warheads to follow that research. So there's historically been a wide-ranging research agenda in all of these areas. The EMP, so-called high radiation neutron weapons. Now, that does not mean that it's pursued all of these areas all the way to production of weapons for this, but there has been research in all of these areas. Now, the extent to which that's been followed up, including recently, I do not know. It's a good question.
Another question on tactical nuclear weapons. Now, in recent years, we've started to see a shift back to this idea. Even we were talking about, okay, could we be using low yield nuclear weapons on the battlefield again, like we had back, I guess, goes back to the 50s, really. And then we got away from that. Is that something that we see the Chinese also experimenting with, that they might be able to use low yield tactical nuclear weapons?
So it's a good question, and that is why monitoring testing is so important. It's to be able to understand all of the different ways in which a new warhead might be developing, or a series of new warheads. If you can monitor the tests, then this can give you insight into weapon types that are being developed. Now, one hypothesis is that yes, China is developing new warheads, and it's not simply to modernize its current method of deployment, but rather to develop new weapons and new ways of deploying them. And that could include miniaturization of the warhead to make it smaller to fit on smaller weapons for either a tactical use or smaller yield so-called counterforce use. This would fit into now in seeing these developments, and seeing any of these developments, I'm not saying I've seen this at Lop Nur, but in general, this is a hypothesis about this next stage of development for China's nuclear weapons program. If this is the case, there would be a real gap between that and understanding the doctrine for use. Does this mean that China might be developing a nuclear warfighting capability? Now, the United States and the Soviet Union really did develop this capability during the Cold War, as you alluded to, from the 50s all the way through really the 80s. There was always this capability. So it's possible that, yes, one hypothesis that, yes, China's developing not just more, but also more robust capabilities, a wider variety of capabilities, including counterforce, even tactical on the battlefield against conventional forces, weapon systems. So that's all possible. That's all on the table. And that's part of why there should be so much concern about all of this, Michael. It's just that all of these new capabilities really introduce a wide variety of scenarios, none of which are very good for human security and safety and well-being.
Yeah, I mean, there all points to a need to, take China as seriously as a player as Russia, in my mind, on these issues, and which we really hadn't done and probably need to do. I want to go back to something that you mentioned when you started out and why you got interested in this topic. So, go back to that. What started you on this topic, Renny, and what were some of the discoveries you made besides, from the geospatial standpoint about how China looked at the whole issue of nuclear weapons? How they saw it as a threat. The only time they were used in war was in against Japan and really in their neighborhood. How did that impact their thinking early on their nuclear weapons program?
Yeah. So it all started with me talking to my advisor. So my advisor was Stephen David at Johns Hopkins in the Homewood campus. And he and I were talking, and I'd always been interested in nuclear weapons, and he was always interested in China and China's program. As we, over several weeks, kind of put our heads together, and we hammered out this idea of a research project both of us were interested in. And as you know, in the academy, the student can have a great idea, but the advisor is the gatekeeper and also needs to buy into it. And so we developed this project together based on both of our interests. And early on, I was struck by a few things. First, yes, China did develop a nuclear weapons program, but never seemed to take it very seriously from an investment point of view. The investment in this program was dwarfed by other conventional military investments during the Mao Zedong era, and that's from 1949 to 1976. And so I thought that was odd, that they developed the capability, but never invested further into building a lot of weapons. They developed the capability to produce and detonate one weapon, and build a few hundred, but never beyond that. So that was interesting. And then what I found was that ideas among military leaders, particularly Mao Zedong, focused on mass mobilized human willpower as the focus of military power, that was more important than any high technology weapon system. That was more important than nuclear weapons. In fact, Mao repeatedly stated publicly and privately in secret journals that are now, some of which have been public record, that China's willpower could, and ideology and belief in communism and socialism could defeat nuclear weapons and an adversary armed with nuclear weapons. And so I thought that was fascinating. And I thought that was the key to why the program remained limited. Now, they constructed the program because it's thought, that one of the reasons that motivated this was that in 1955, when China was preparing to invade Taiwan, that the United States intervened. Well, this is really during the 1950s, that there were signals from the United States that the United States would use nuclear weapons against China if they actually did invade Taiwan fully, and that this stopped China at the time, but in response, China initiated its own program. That's one of the explanations for what motivated it in the first place. And yet once it was created, it remained small. And I think ideas about the military, in particular, ideology, really was one of the main limiting factors for the program.
So they didn't have an idea on it like this is a great expression of our national power, like some countries have in terms of trying to develop this. That wasn't so much the driver for it.
Not at the time. And at the time, during the Mao era, there were a lot of anti-intellectual movements, and power was seen to be invested both politically, but then also academically in education and the field of technology. If there were really smart people in the field of technology developing systems, this was another locus of power that could challenge the political authority. And so Mao in particular spurred several clear anti-intellectual movements, for example, the Cultural Revolution, that directly interfered with the nuclear weapons program. In fact, there are multiple instances where Cultural Revolution activities, this is a domestic Chinese political event, and it's all about power relationships between Mao and other important leaders, and him wanting to develop and maintain his own power over the whole country. As a result of several Cultural Revolution activities, nuclear weapons bases were overrun periodically, and experiments were stopped. Some scientists were killed. I mean, so it directly interfered with the program. And I think that this was not just a one-off and superficial issue. I mean, this went to the heart of why the program remained limited. It was a domestic definition of what power was, what power meant, and what it should be. And Mao always emphasized mass mobilized human willpower over everything. He emphasized it in domestic politics, and it directly interfered with the nuclear weapons program. So it was just a different focus of priorities.
Well, thanks for these great insights today. You really showed what can be done just with open source available GeoInt, and combining that with regular open sources. Of course, one of our questions asked about following up with ground truth. Obviously, there's a lot of what clandestine could contribute to this topic, but we are seeing today just what is just available for independent researchers, really on extremely important topics. And also, thank you for your insights on as a sinologist on China and on the background on this program. I'm sure there's going to be more opportunities for us to get together and discuss this. So thanks everybody today for great questions on this. We thank Renny for a terrific presentation. We look forward to having you back, and hopefully not to discuss a test, right?
Yes, hopefully not.
That's really not what we'd like. We'd like that not to happen, that things obviously would calm down. And let me also remind our viewers to keep in mind that we'll be holding, we'll have another Inside Intelligence in December. I'm looking to get an expert to talk about the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is obviously something that's very much in the news, and we could use some more expert background on that. So stay tuned for that. And so that's it for us. And thank you very much for joining us today. We thank our guest and hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you so much for everybody. Thank you. And thank you, Michael.